We'll get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the conclusion of Pest Month in the Fruit and Vegetable Team's winter webinar series. My name is Marissa Shu. I'm an integrated pest management educator with the University of Minnesota Extension. So I work with vegetable farmers on how we holistically approach dealing with insects, diseases, and weeds. So we'll be just talking about the weed part of all of that for the next 45 minutes to an hour-ish. And we're going to be talking about approaching weeds and thinking through things the way we think about dealing with insects or diseases. When we talked about pumpkins or when we talked about tomatoes, we talked about like when you are trying to manage a disease like early blight or like powdery mildew, you want to really understand that pathogen and how it interacts with your crops. Because when you understand that and the life cycle of that pathogen or that beetle, that's going to be what allows you to manage it well. And to manage weeds well, we have to think about them in kind of the same way. So that's what we're going to be introducing and talking through for the next, again, 45 minutes to an hour. By this, I hope you guys have a little bit of an idea of a way to approach weeds in a way that might be more strategical, potentially maybe even labor saving, as well as places to learn more about the specific weeds you have so you can kind of hack them, find times in their week where your management is going to be most effective. Okay, so we're going to be focusing mostly on kind of like the bottom part of the IPM pyramid. So we're talking a lot about cultural and physical controls for the last 50, last in the 2000s, we've primarily been taught thinking a lot about herbicides to manage weeds. After World War II, we had this big boom, this big increase in the types of pesticides available to manage all kinds of pests in all kinds of crops. And that led to somewhat of an over-reliance on these tools. Hence, where integrated pest management comes in, where we use pesticides as just one of many, many tools we should use. And this is especially true in the worlds of herbicides and the world of growing vegetables. So we'll look at a couple of graphs about why it is important not just to rely on herbicides to help us manage our weed problems. This graph here is from Iowa State University, and we are looking at two things on this bar chart. One, we have our blue line. This is the number of new herbicide groups introduced. A group of herbicides would be a certain way that herbicides interact with weeds and kill them. So kind of new discoveries in ways uh, different chemistries can help us manage weeds. So you can see we have a peak of that in the 70s, but then it's kind of flatlined. And we haven't had the introduction of new herbicide groups in a very long time. Running at the same timeline as that, we have the weeds that are getting better at life. They're learning how to deal with the herbicides we do have. And so here our red line represents the number of herbicide resistances in the weed species water hemp, which we have in some spots in Minnesota. And every year it seems like we discover a new weed, not just water hemp, that has resistances to our already limited pool of herbicides we have available. I want to note that this is from the world of corn and soybeans, crops that cover huge acreages that get tons of money and time and research attention put into them. They have a much broader suite of herbicides available in the first place compared to us fruit and vegetable growers. So we have fewer tools and our weeds are getting better at dodging those tools. Here's another look at what herbicide resistance looks like across many weeds and many types of herbicides. So each one of our different colored lines here is basically a different related group of herbicides, herbicides that all use the same kind of way of hacking and killing a plant. And for a ton of our different herbicide groups, we have many, many species of weeds that are becoming resistant to them. New weed species are developing resistances every year and being found in new places. So whether you are an organic grower who doesn't use herbicides or a grower who does dip their toe into the herbicide pool, it is important for all of us to reframe and think holistically about weed management because some of the tools we've relied on very heavily for a long time are not increasingly not cutting it anymore. So where does that leave us? That leaves us with getting back to bases and approaching things in an integrated, holistic framework. So we'll kind of start to approach weeds from an integrated pest management, integrated weed management, holistic type framework. Whenever we think about managing pests, I think of it as having three major steps: a building knowledge step, a decision-making step, and then a step where we actually take active controls. So when you think about What kind of knowledge do we need to know about weeds? We have to understand the specific weeds on your farm. We started in the chat with share your number one weed, and we had quite a wide palette of number one weeds on lots of different farms. Every farm has weeds, but who those specific problems are a little bit different on every single vegetable farm you go to. You don't need to identify everything that is not a crop in your fields, but get to know like your 3 to 4 problem weeds. Now, as you think about these weeds, think about what kind of equipment you have, what kind of time you have, what kind of labor you have, because the interplay between all those factors is going to be what informs the decisions you make about managing weeds. Weed management is tricky to figure out. Weed scientists will say the goal is zero weeds, but like, come on, we live in the real world. We have lots of other things to do besides me standing out in the field with a hoe. So, thinking about what are the ways that weeds are negatively interacting with our specific crops, uh, along with the knowledge we built in step one, that helps us figure out what are the really important times and scales for weed management on our farm specifically. Finally, under IPM, we have our control tactics, be them cultural in nature, which means things for in the case of weeds, things like rotation, shifting growing periods, playing with different plant families, stuff like that. We have our physical controls. Physical controls, I think, are most relevant for weeds. When we think about all the different types of pests we are oftentimes physically removing the weed from our space. Sometimes for weeds, we have biological controls. Maybe not in vegetable world, but there was just a bunch of news that came out in the last week that they found a biological control for the weed garlic mustard, where it's a beetle that loves to eat garlic mustard. So a biological tool for managing that specific woodland weed. And finally, we have our chemical controls, which we'll talk a teeny bit about, but not the focus of what we're doing today. So let's start getting into each one of those 3 big steps. So, what do we need to know about the weeds we have on our farm? We have to identify it. Unfortunately, identifying plants, not my favorite thing to do. I went to school to identify bugs. So, like, when I have to look at a plant, it's much more hard for me, much less exciting. So, it is painful, but we do have to do it. And there are tools that can help us do it. Once we've identified, again, like our 3 to 4 problem weeds, that's when we got to dive into that biology. How is that weed surviving on our farm? How is it moving around our farm? What is happening on our farm that is prompting it to grow? This can seem kind of basic, but in these nuances is where you get a good idea about, like, okay, I really need to do mulch. I really need to do timed mechanical cultivation. Understanding the weeds biology is what helps you make those decisions. So, as we start to think about weeds, we also want to think about their life cycles. So, again, we talk about bug life cycles all the time. We talk about disease cycles all the time. Each species of weed has a life cycle all their own, and those are a big factor in how they get onto your farm, but also how they hang around on your farm and become a consistent problem. And to get to know this, again, we have to do ID, and there are lots of different resources for every kind of mind and ways people like to think and look and do all that weed stuff. I am a book person. I like looking at a reference book, seeing stuff all collected together on a printed page instead of staring at a screen is what I like to do. Books I really like for identifying weeds. My ride or die is Weeds of the Northeast. It's this book up here. It recently has a newish edition and has quite a pretty cover, but this is the one that is like riding um, in the passenger seat when I'm doing farm visits in summer. This is the book that has good ID pictures of different life stages of weeds. So it's a nice book to have around if you're a book person. Other nice ones, Weeds of the Midwestern United States and Central Canada, kind of an oldie but goodie extension type resource. Same with Weeds of North Central States. We're talking more about the world of apps and websites and stuff like that. Minnesota Wildflowers has some pretty good available pictures for some weedy species in Minnesota. And then we get into the big world of apps. ID Weeds is an extension supported weed ID app. It's a little clunky, but it can get the job done. Then beyond that, you have iNaturalist and all these other picture, crowdsourcing, even AI-based apps. Anytime you're using apps for identification of anything, I always encourage people to take whatever the app tells you as kind of the first jumping off point of research, but don't take whatever its idea is as 100% the truth. For example, iNaturalist can be really reliable, but as the name implies, it is an app that is developed for looking at stuff in natural areas, which are farms. They are in nature, but they are not quite the setting that these apps were designed to work in. So we're kind of tweaking the app's intended use, which can make the IDs we get need to be want to do a little bit of verification. And again, we don't have to spend tons of time doing this. Most farms, again, most of their weed problems come to 3 to 4 species. So it doesn't have to take a whole day. It could take an hour with a phone and a book and some pictures to make sure you know for sure who your weeds are. As we get to know our weeds, it can be really helpful to integrate some of this into a farm map we might already have. A lot of us might have a map that looks like this to help us figure out planting dates and rotation and for a little bit of record keeping. Maybe print another copy of this out. And as you go through and identify weeds, circle the areas where you know you have certain weed problems. So, like you go in, you finally identify that annoying grass that's over here. You identify as yellow foxtail, kind of highlight this is the area of my farm where I have a yellow foxtail problem because that, again, as you go in to make your plan and your weed management decisions, which might happen this time of year when your crops aren't around and your weeds aren't around, this can be a really helpful planning tool for these slower times when you actually have time to think and plan and learn more about your weeds. So, as we identify weeds, what are the things we want to know about them? One, we want to know their life cycle. Are they a weed that is going from seed to seed every year, and those seeds are building up in my soil and causing me problems every year? Is it something like ragweed, for example, where it produces thousands of seeds that last a year or two in the soil? Is it a biennial weed? Some of our thistle species are biennials, or things like curly dock are biennials. For our biennial weeds, the first year they grow what is called a basal rosette. They basically grow this huge circular cluster really close to the ground. It'll be like a big, angry, leafy. They almost look like dinner plates. Like they can be quite big, round, and flat, where it's just trying to harvest energy from the sun that it sends to its roots. And then the next year, it uses all that energy it built up from year one to spring ahead, get super tall, produce tons of seeds, start the cycle over again. Or is it, I'm loath to say this is the worst kind of weed of all, but I think these are some of the most annoying and hard to manage ones would be our perennial weeds. I saw lots of people in the chat mention Canada thistle. That is one of the trickiest to manage perennial weeds on a lot of our vegetable farms. But we also have some perennial grass species. So these are ones that have big storage roots that can be buried very deep in the ground, that can creep um, from one part of the farm slowly, slowly, slowly to another through the growth and then sprouting of these roots. So get to know that because again, the way you manage Canada thistle is very, very different than the way you manage ragweed. So ID, knowing their life cycle, super helpful. For our annual weeds, we'll be focusing mostly on annual weeds because broad strategies work on all of them, as opposed to some of our perennial weeds where you get a little bit more species specific. But a lot of the weeds on fruits and vegetable farms are annual in nature and are coming from tiny, tiny seeds. This diagram here shows us a comparison of some of our crop seeds, things like wheat, soybean, corn, big seeds that are coming with lots of energy for that tiny baby plant compared to some of our weed seeds. So things like pigweeds, lamb's quarters, foxtails, velvet leaf. They make relatively small seeds that are hard for us to see, really are specialized in getting moved around. And they make tons of them. That is one of the benefits of making a tiny seed is you are just producing a ton. And it doesn't matter if lots of them don't make it because you're making, 73,000. So who cares if 72,000 of them don't live? That's still 500 to 1,000 lamb quarters. So one thing that I don't know if it's helpful to know, but is motivating to know about some of our weed species is how many seeds they make and how long those seeds can survive in the soil on our farms. So here we have an example weed, common lamb's quarters. I believe I saw this as some people in the chats problem, nemesis weed on their farm. Common lamb's quarters can make around 72,500 seeds per plant. Sometimes more, sometimes less, depends on how robust and healthy and happy the lamb's quarters is. Those seeds fall into our soil and then they can last a really long time. There's very interesting studies that, like there's a study that's been going on for over 150 years at Michigan State where a botanist way back when, like put put different seeds in a like glass bottle full of sand and buried it. And every 5 years, they get to dig up a bottle and see if the seeds still germinate. They have one species of plant that is still germinating after 150 years. So seeds, including the seeds of our weeds, can last a really long time. For lamb's quarters, it takes 12 years, but that's estimated for half of those 72,000 seeds that fell off one plant in 1 year to die in the soil. Sometimes you'll hear weed scientists say 1 year's seeding is 7 years weeding, because again, they're making tons of seeds that they live and wait in the soil for a very long time. Not every single weed is quite that grim when it comes to the seeds they make and how long they last. Here we have the example of common ragweed. So, one of the weeds that is responsible for your seasonal allergies produces around 3,500 seeds per plant. And those seeds don't last that long, a year and a half for roughly 50% of them to die in the soil. So I guess there's like an optimism. If common ragweed is one of your main weeds, it won't take you like your whole farming career to maybe get this problem in control because the seeds don't last that long. Here's the seed production and how long it takes some of the seeds to die for some other common weed species. So you can see very common for them to make thousands of seeds that can last quite a long time. So we have weeds. Our annual weeds make thousands of seeds that last a long time in the soil, but these seeds are also built to move around. Um, so when I think about a dandelion that we blow on and make a wish, those are seeds that are evolved to move around with wind and not just with our wishes. We have other species of weeds, things like foxtail, where those seeds are evolved to hitch rides to people, to animals, to equipment. We even have weed species, curly dock, one of our biennial weeds. They are built to float. So our tiny weed seeds, easy for them to move around, both because they're small, unnoticeable size, but also because they're built to move. So, how do weed seeds get onto our farm and move around on our farm? It's very easy for these weed seeds to hitch rides. So, what we're seeing in these flats here is the result of a small experiment done by the weed scientist at Cornell University. Cornell does a ton of vegetable research. They have a really big vegetable research farm. And for this little experiment, she just went to the tractors of the university owned tractors. She scraped the mud off their wheels and then she put them in the greenhouse to see what grew. And what grew was weeds. Anytime we have clumps of dirt attached to our shoes, attached to our equipment, attached to the hooves of livestock, it's easy for weed seeds to hitch a ride and move around. So if you think about, we have our farm map where maybe we know we have weeds in a really concentrated problem area. Think about how soil and water might move out of that area as a way of limiting the amount of your farm that has that problem. We also have weeds that move around with water. So we had that curly dock seed that is evolved to float. But anytime we have moving soil, moving water, weed seeds sitting on the surface of the soil, those weed seeds are going to get moved around, be that during spring floods, heavy rains, winter freeze thaw events. Those are potential times where weed seeds can hitch a ride and move to somewhere new on our farm. One way we can get weed seeds introduced that we've never seen maybe on our farm before would be from contaminated seed. So anytime we are planting a crop, planting a cover crop, we want to use quality sources because that reduces the chance that we get these introduction of weeds from somewhere else. So here's an example of a study done at Michigan State where they had a very boring job for an undergrad to sit at a microscope and sort out winter rye from non-winter rye seeds. Like my neck hurts thinking about spending this much time at the scope. But in the winter rye sample that was looked at, for example, here, based on the number of seeds they found, there were about roughly 95 weed seeds per 1 pound of winter rye, which doesn't sound that bad. But when you think about applying this at the agronomic rate, you'd be spreading 10,000 weed speeds, potentially of species you don't even have if you were planting this contaminated winter rye cover crop. Another way we can have weeds enter our farms be anytime we're bringing biological amendments on, be it straw to try to prevent other weeds or compost, which some people use, in a deep bed to reduce the amount of weed germination, but also for nutrition. It's really hard to find a straw mulch that is not weedy, and depending on which weeds you have and are worried about, straw mulch might not even work at all. The same thing can happen with compost. When compost or manures aren't composted correctly, where we're getting those high internal temperatures in the pile combined with turning that is getting at a high enough temperature for long enough for weed seeds to be killed, that is hard. That is a very hard, specific scientific process to get to happen sometimes. And when things aren't composted thoroughly, we get weed seed introductions. Um, yeah. And I was thinking about sorry, I took out some slides that are about the amount of weed seeds that can survive like going through the digestive tracts of animals. So we want manures and stuff to always be composted because a lot of our most annoying weeds, they can survive going through a pig or a chicken or a cow, unfortunately. We'll close this section off by a graphic that gives us an idea of how ways weeds move around. So on our y-axis here, we have different modes of transportation ranging from local as rain splash to as big as livestock transported across state lines. Our x-axis here is how far weed seeds travel. So again, we can kind of see we have some things that can happen within fields, and between regions. So these are the kinds of things to think about. And again, it's a lot of it represents like if you've ever heard me or someone else talk about soil-borne diseases. It's keeping things clean, keeping mud from moving around, that kind of stuff, helpful in preventing diseases from moving around, but also helpful in preventing those tiny, tiny weed seeds from moving around. But despite our best efforts, every farm has weeds. And a lot of those weeds are annual in nature and coming from our weed seed bank. This is a concept in weed management that, we have our soil on our farm and there's, grains of sand and there's organic matter and there's bacteria and fungi make up that soil, but weed seeds are also present in that soil. And those weed seeds, they can easily number in the thousands. The weed seed bank is going to be different on every farm and will be a reflection of the history of whatever has happened there. And so every time we have a weed, complete its life cycle, get in that far out corner of the field where we maybe see it out of the corner of our eye, but never have the time to go out and pull it, that weed set seeds, those seeds will land on the surface of the soil, and they may or may not be able to enter the weed seed bank. Weed seeds that sit on the surface of the soil have a chance of being eaten. There are the weed seed is great food for some bird species, for rodents, even for there's some species of beetles that are really, really good at eating weed seeds. So some seeds will get eaten, some might not, especially if we're going in and we're turning the soil and those weed seeds never sit on the surface at all. Once our weed seeds are buried in the soil, they can lay in wait for a long time. Weed seeds are smart. Each species has certain conditions that will prompt it to grow, and it knows how to sense those conditions. So some weed seeds, they might get too old, they might age out and die, but a lot of them will survive year after year after year until they get the right combination of light and water and cold exposure and heat. So some die in the soil, some die in germination, but some get the signal that it is time to go. They start to grow, they get established, and that is kind of the suite of weeds that we'll end up dealing with in a given year. There'll still be weeds, seeds in the soil, whether they get more get added to comes down to how we manage the space on our farm. So, thinking about this germination part of the weed equation, what do weed seeds need to germinate? They need all the same stuff our crops need to germinate. They need soil contact, they need light, they need water, they need nutrients, they need warmth. And when they get those specific signals, they start to grow. So, oftentimes, when we're getting our fields ready for our crops to germinate and grow, the weed seeds are getting those exact same signals. So, when we start our field prep, weeds get prepped, they start to grow. But what each weed species needs to germinate and get started is a little bit different for every single species. So here we have two example weed species. We have our common ragweed here on the left, and on the right, we have our lamb's quarters, two common weeds on farms. Each one of them like to be buried at different depths and need different ranges of temperature to start to grow. Our ragweed, they can germinate from up to an inch depth in the soil, while our common lamb's quarters, it is happiest and does best and gets the signal that it's time to grow when it's really shallow, in the first 0.1, 0.2 inches of the soil. Some weed seeds need stratification. If you've ever done like native plant growth, I'm sure you've thought about this, but some of our plant seeds, they need to get cold and then warm again in order to germinate. Common ragweed is one of those weeds. Not every single weed species needs this. Some, they can fall on the ground and start to grow again in the same year. Knowing these specific things for your specific weeds, again, are really helpful in figuring out, is the way I'm doing field prep making my weeds germinate? Is there a mulch that can keep these conditions away? Understanding this stuff helps us really fine tune our weed management. So here we have an example of what seed banks look like at different vegetable farms. This is from a study in Maine where they were looking at weed seed banks and weed management on organic vegetable farms around the state of Maine. So here again, we just have soil that was taken from 6 different farms, put in a greenhouse, like let's see which weeds grow. Some vegetable farms really dominated by grassy weeds, others more by broadleaf weeds, but it's different on every farm. So again, spend the time to do your own farm's specific ID. Um, Again, looking at these highlights, yes, there's different species, but there's not that many different species. Get to know your 3 to 4 weeds for your problems. This soil sample from here up on the right, this was from a vegetable farm that had been doing holistic, like weed seed bank based management of their vegetable farm and their weeds for 30 years. And so they had almost completely flushed out the weed seeds out of their weed seed bank. So, there may be new introductions of weed seeds from birds, from splashing in water, but in general, weed seeds were no longer a major component of their soil. So, this is all to say that it is kind of a Herculean task to manage weeds on your farm with this kind of long-term weed seed bank mindset where you want to deplete the number of weeds in your seed bank and reduce the amount of time seeds are allowed to enter it. But it is something we can do. If you have a goal on your farm to like increase soil organic matter, like that is a goal that like you get 1% every 10 years you work on it. So you can have these long-term goals like that and potentially achieve them. It is possible to bring the local population of potential weeds on your farm down. It just takes, unfortunately, some time. If you want to get to know your weeds, I cannot recommend this book enough. Manage Weeds on Your Farm is a publication from SARE. I don't know if I should say this. Like, I don't know if extension educators should be like, I have a favorite extension publication, but like, this might be my favorite extension publication. I want to quick swap the screens we're looking at so we can take a peek at this together. Let me just quick switch out my screen share. Well, let's see here. Stop share. Force you all to look at me in jumbo size. Share. Manage weeds on your farm. Okay. So manage weeds on your farm. It is available as a pretty ginormous soft cover book. If you're ever at a conference and you see a SARE table where they have this available for the grabbing for free, grab it. You will not regret it. Um, when you're looking at this book, the first half of it roughly will go into a lot of the stuff we're talking about today, like how to think about weeds holistically, um, different weed management strategies. But my favorite element of this book is in the back half where you have little maximum like 6-page chapters about different weeds, and it includes all this really fine-tune biological specific information that you need to manage it well. So for example, let's click Canada thistle. I saw that as a one people mentioned. So it has some pictures that might help us identify Canada thistle. I don't think of this as being primarily an ID resource, more of a deeper learning resource. But it gets into all this really specific stuff about their biology that I always find super interesting. And basically, every time I reread one of these chapters, I learn something new. They have really helpful summaries of like a broad body of research on management that will help you figure out what's the right, if I'm mechanically cultivating, what's the right schedule? If I want to use a mulch, what kind of mulch is most appropriate? How much light blocking actually needs to happen? Is there a nutrition component that might encourage this weed to grow or not grow? I was just skimming this one before we hopped on the chat, and the thing that I found really interesting was they're talking about how Canada thistles often a problem in grain crops. Thistle stalks, including mature seeds, are often present in baled grain straw. Similarly, manure that includes grain straw bedding is often contaminated with Canada thistle. Like, uh, I learned something that like blows my mind, but also makes me scared every time I check out this book. I cannot recommend checking that out enough, and I will reshare my slide so that is back on the main screen. But again, you identify your 3 to 4 weeds, you print out and read the chapter in this book, and you will have a good basis to go into actually deciding, okay, how's the best way to manage this specific weed I have? So let's get into our decision making. Weeds are important to manage because they reduce yield, potentially in really dramatic ways. In studies where they compare weeded cabbage to cabbage that never gets weeded, the reduction in yield is like 60 to 80%. So if we don't do any weed management, we lose our crops. And if we don't do enough weed management, we're not going to hit the goals maybe we set for ourselves at the beginning of the year. Not maybe going to be able to fulfill a contract. So what's our threshold for weeds? Ideally zero. We don't want weeds in our space because they're competing with our crops for light, for water, for nutrition, for space. But like, okay, we live in the real world. What are some more actually helpful decision prompts, thresholds we might have when dealing with weeds? One goal we might have would be zero weed seed rain. An idea that, okay, there's already weed seeds in our soil. I'm already drowning in weeds. I'm not going to let any weed put any more seeds into my soil. I'm going to be really aggressive about chopping down weed escapes, mowing weeds so that they're not able to flower. They're not able to put more seeds in the soil again. So this concept that 1 year's seeding is 7 years weeding. I'm ready to never put 7 more years of weeding into my soil again. That might be a goal we have. We might be thinking about, I want to manage weeds in a way where I have a diverse means of control, where I'm able to utilize maybe some hoeing, maybe some implements on a tractor, maybe some mulches. I want to be able to use a combination of strategies to keep my weeds at bay and keep certain problem weeds that don't care about the tillage tools I have from booming and becoming a problem. If we're thinking about mechanically cultivating weeds, a great threshold is the white thread stage. This is a concept we'll talk about in a few slides, but basically when weed seeds first germinate, they are tiny. Again, they're coming from tiny seeds. There's not that much energy for them to get started with. So they will emerge, they'll have a tiny singular root and a tiny singular shoot. They will essentially look like a thread pulled off of your clothes. And if we're trying to mechanically kill weeds with tools, with hoeing, when we kill weeds at this time, it is super, super easy to do because that's enough to kill them. They're out of energy. They can't reroot. They can't reshoot because there's no energy for them to do that. If we have perennial weeds, the big thing we want to think about as we decide when and how we manage them is that we have to deplete their storage roots. So if we're trying to manage Canada thistle, we need to understand, when is this plant taking more energy out of its root than putting into its roots? Those are going to be the most effective times for us to harass, mow, whack, chop our perennial weeds. So here we have a picture of this white thread concept. So here we have two species, or two ages of a weed. On the right, we have our weeds that are in the white threads. You can see tiny root, tiny shoot, 2 leaves or less. Here we have weeds that are only a few days older. They already have, they have four-ish leaves, and they have a much more developed root system. Depending on the tools we're trying to use to kill weeds, these might already be too big for some of our weed control tools to do anything about. Well, these ones can be killed by a lot of different tools. We'll talk about tools in a few slides, I believe. Another really important time to think about weed management is a concept, a time frame called the critical weed-free period. So just like maybe bad things that happen to childhood can like haunt us for the rest of our lives. The stress from competing with weeds for a freshly germinated plant, for a transplant, competition when those plants are very young, just getting established, will haunt them for the rest of the life. Competing with weeds when you are a small plant will reduce your yield because you're going to spend so much energy competing with weeds at a time when you don't really even have that much availability of energy to you in the first place because you're just getting started. You're just establishing in a new soil, expanding your roots, getting your first leaves up, first exposure to life. That's a really important time to control weeds on our crops. For most of our crops, this is generally like the first 3 to 4 weeks of their lives in being outside. We ideally want that period of their life to be weed free. So for some crops, they're never that good at competing with weeds. I think about a pumpkin, which goes through a very aggressive stage of growth where they're vining out, they're spreading, they're climbing. Like pumpkins, after this first month of growth, they get very competitive. They can compete with weeds. compared to an onion, which is like, oh, growing straight up and down its whole life and like never gets good at competing with weeds. But generally, aim for pretty weed free in the first month of our plant's life. Okay. So moving into, okay, we have a goal of critical weed free period and zero seed rain, and maybe, those are the two we're going to try to really focus on. As we try to hit these two goals in weed management, we want as many tools as possible. Just as each weed like has its biology that makes it really good at some stuff, it has stuff that's also bad at dealing with. So by having a variety of tools, we are exploiting the weaknesses of as many species of weeds as possible. The other thing I think that is different about thinking about weed management compared to insect management or disease management is we kind of think about areas within our fields in different ways. We have different tools and levels of aggressiveness available to us when we're trying to manage the weeds that are between the row compared to the weeds are within the row. So, for example, if we're thinking about tools that we might use for cultivation, oftentimes the tools we can use between the row we can't use them within the row because our crops are there and they're so aggressive they'd hurt our crop. So thinking that we need tools for both of those settings can be helpful as we start to think about what improved weed management might look like on our farm. So let's start to sort our tools, starting with our cultural controls. And again, these are things that deal with how we set up our farms, how we fertilize, how we water, like the basic horticulture of growing our crops will also have implications for weeds' success or failure. So here we really want to get to know our weeds and especially get to know the things that they need to germinate. One of Achieving that critical weed-free period is much easier if we're not prompting our weeds to germinate in the first place. So how can we prevent weed seeds from germinating? In vegetables, we have a wide variety of mulches, be they plastic, biologic, living, lots of different things that we can use to try to prevent weed seeds from getting the amount of light or water that we need. Another thing we have is called the stale seedbed technique. We're going to talk about these two things now. So when we think about mulches, they're primarily taking away the light access, maybe some of the access to formed soil, maybe some of them keep the weeds from accessing water and nutrients. But again, it's super important to know our weeds. Like if I could have read more of the on the other tab when I was reading about Canada thistle, you need super reduced light for a mulch to work for Canada thistle. Every year I talk with farmers who want to use a straw mulch for Canada thistle, but like Canada thistle doesn't care if there's straw mulch because there's still pockets of light and it's pulling energy from its roots, so it's gonna be able to shoot through that straw and keep growing. So knowing your weed is going to help you figure out is mulching going to work and what mulch might work. So what kind of mulch options do we have? They look sometimes a little bit different between the row and within the row. So within the row, we have the classic example of like the tightly laid, either biodegradable or not, black horticultural plastic it's pretty common to grow vegetables in Minnesota in. We also have options that are between rows. So I know growers who use silage tarps, landscape fabric, either between the row or sometimes within the row, depending on the crop and the weeds you have. This can be super, super successful because it blocks out tons and tons of light. We also have more organic options. So organic being like not made of plastic in this case. We don't have great in-row options. It is possible, to get straw closely laid within the row, but that can take a lot of finesse, and finding a good straw that isn't just introducing weeds is a real pain in the butt. You also need a lot of straw mulch to get this to work. The light reduction levels you need for some weeds are super, super high. So this is going to be a thick, multi-inch, crunchy layer of mulch in order for good control. Increasingly, there have interest and success in Minnesota with living between row mulches. So, a clover crop that you have to manage. It does have to get mowed, but otherwise it is ideally healthy enough, vital enough where it is smothering out weeds and you're mowing it back so it's not competing with your crops. I was at where was I at? There was a SARE project. I think it was the University of Wisconsin SARE project, but Food Farm up in Renshaw was one of the collaborators, and they had some really beautiful, really effective between row mulches. Maybe I'll see if I can dig up that study and post it in the chat when we're done. Okay. Another really important, I think, undervalued cultural control in some of our vegetable crops would be the stale seedbed technique. So the stale seedbed technique kind of uses the idea that when we prep our fields, weed seeds get the signal that it is time to grow. And we use that signal to just like kill weeds. So we plant our field, we prep our field for planting maybe a month before we intend to plant. We let a bunch of weed seeds flush out, we kill them, and then we actually plant. This is not the right fit for every single vegetable, but I think it's a great option if we have an area where we're growing some of those, warm season, big seeded crops. We're not planting sweet corn, pumpkins till June, mid-June in some parts of the state. But before that planting in mid-June, we have a big window where we can do something like this and really aggressively make a huge withdrawal from our weed seed bank. So here's what the sale seedbed technique kind of looks like. So we have our farms, we have our weed seed bank. We prep our field like we are going to plant pumpkins. That surfaces weed seeds, that turns the soil. So all of a sudden there's warmth and heat and light and our weed seeds start to grow. We then go in and just kill them. We don't have a crop in there, so we can be really aggressive in the way we kill our weed seeds. This could be with cultivation if we have a tool we like to use, or this could just be like a broad spectrum herbicide. Something like glyphosate can be very effective at terminating all these fresh, young, tender weeds. After that, we have removed weed seeds. We are dealing with much fewer. Generally, weed seeds don't germinate from like deeper within than like the top 2 inches of the soil. Like so on my hands, that's like, the segment between my first and second knuckle, that's an inch. Weed seeds are germinating from 2 inches or less in terms of soil depth. So as long as, we do this stale seed bed technique, that we never till or cultivate deeper than 2 inches, we will have a significantly reduced weed pressure going into the growing season, as long as we're never digging deeper than that 2 inches. Okay, next we have our physical controls. So removing weeds with some kind of cultivation tool. And when you think about moving soil to manage weeds, think about it differently than the type of tillage you might do at the end of the season or when you're doing prep. When we're trying to cultivate for weeds, we're really just trying to disturb and cut off those top 2 inches of the soil. We don't need to go any deeper because there's no weeds really actively growing, at least for annual species. They are growing and most active and germinating in the top 2 inches. So we don't need to go that deep. We don't need that aggressive of tools to kill small weeds that are in that white thread stage. So our goal is shallow, light, minimal disturbance cultivation when we are trying to physically manage weeds. There are tools for all sizes, scales, desire to have a tractor, desire to deal with engines. There are tools that can make cultivation much more quick, time efficient, less backbreaking, at all kinds of different scales. There are tools that are really well suited between row and within row. If you've never dug into the world of cultivation tools, it's a really interesting world. Um, and there's more innovation in it than you might think. Like you might think like humans are not still inventing new effective types of hoes, but like somehow we are. So if you haven't shopped for a new hoe in like the last 5 years, like I encourage you to shop around because there are a lot more tools that are really ergonomic, really effective, really quick. And if you understand your weed and how little it might take to kill it at some points in its life cycle, you can save yourself a lot of time and a lot of back-breaking labor. And that SARE resource I mentioned, they have a wonderful chapter about physical weed management that talks all about different types of implements from like hoe to wheel hoe to tractor. There's a lot available, and you can find something that might be really helpful for you, no matter what the scale of your farm is. Finally, we have our chemical controls, our herbicides. As always, whenever we're talking about spray stuff, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, I highly recommend checking out the Midwest Vegetable Production Guide. There are sections on this for broadleaf weeds, grasses before those weeds emerge and after those weeds emerge. There's not a ton of organic options because the world of organic options for weed control, organic herbicides are like they're basically acids that will burn off the top of the plant but not kill it. So if you're an organic grower, think more about those physical and cultural controls. But if you're not a certified organic grower and you have something like Canada thistle, maybe looking into an herbicide that you can take care of that thistle in a year or two is more viable for you than trying to battle Canada thistle on your farm for the rest of your mortal life. All right, that is all I have. So we went a little under, so we have plenty of time for questions, but I hope you guys learned a little bit more about ways to think about weeds that might open up some new potential management options or windows for you, and have an idea of where to learn more about the weeds you have on your farm. That is my email. I'm a queen of thinking of the question I wanted to ask as soon as I close the Zoom. So if you think of a question after we're wrapped today, this is my email, mshu@umn.edu. And that's all I have. So I'm happy to take any questions or to just give you your lunch hour back if you want to like open the window and see the sun before you go back to work.
Marissa, there are a couple questions in the Q&A if you want to take a look at those.
We have a question from Kevin about could sawdust work as a mulch to control weeds? I I would lean away from stuff like sawdust. So when we have things like sawdust or things like in a vegetable system, things like wood chips, things like shredded cardboard, one, it can be hard sometimes, like for a sawdust material, to get that thick enough where there might be light reductions, especially when there is wind and maybe movement of sawdust. But also, those stuff like there are bacteria in our soil that want to break down stuff, and we need those bacteria to convert nitrogen from like unusable forms to usable forms for our plants. And when we add stuff like more wood-based amendments, like the bacteria we need to like help feed our plants, like they get tied up in like I'd rather go to this like beautiful, fresh, gorgeous sawdust up here, and they're up there doing their stuff and tying up nitrogen, so actually our plants can get really stressed and lack nutrients. So I would not recommend more of those that wood-based stuff is not always it's not a great fit for the farm. Maybe it can work on the garden scale, but it can really tie up nitrogen when we're trying to have serious regular production. We have a question from Shane about occultation. Oh, I always get these mixed up. Occultation black plastic or clear plastic? I know you know, Shane. I can never remember if it's black or clear. But we have two practices, occultation and solarization. These are where we are using a plastic mulch that is either clear or black to cover the soil. Sometimes maybe we're adding some molasses to encourage biological activity under that plastic tarp. And basically, it gets really, really hot under the tarp and it will kill weeds potentially, and it will also potentially kill pathogens if it gets hot enough. I'm not aware of any new research on occultation. I did just get a notification that a grant we put in to study it more was not funded. Um, but if you are thinking about like this using plastic and heat during like the peak of the Minnesota summer to kill weeds, a big thing to know is what weeds do you have? I've met quite a few people who have tried to use these techniques to get rid of Canada thistle, but like Canada thistle, their roots are like deep, 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 deep in the soil, like feet in the soil. While occultation, solarization, that's only heating up like the top few inches of the soil. So it can be a way to make a reduction in your weed seed bank, but it's not going to help you manage a super deep rooted perennial weed like Canada thistle. Okay. Well, maybe let's trigger the poll, Lauren. And if anyone else thinks of any questions, feel free to type them in. But love it if you filled out this poll. This web series is somehow new for this team. And so if you liked it, if it was annoying, I don't think it was annoying. You can opt in or out, but always curious to know if we're hitting the mark. The goal in extension is to help farmers and people in Minnesota have successful businesses and have successful farms. So if this is helping you find success, we'd love to know it. Or if we're missing the mark, Also super helpful to know. Looks like we have some more. We have a question about burning weed. Jana, do you want to shoot me an email? Because I'd have to do some specific digging because that's not a super common vegetable weed, but I can imagine your frustration. What live mulch have you seen the best with? Um, Living mulch, I think, is kind of in the stage where there is a lot we're still figuring out, and some of it is going to be farm and system specific. Pat, if you type your email, shoot your email to me, I can dig in. If you have one you're interested in, I'd be happy to dig into the research, but I don't think we're quite at a place with these living mulches where we have like, this is the one that always works because this can go sideways. Living mulches can go sideways in all kinds of interesting ways, unfortunately. What new styles of weed control tools could you direct someone to? So if you've never like dug into the world of like, if you have maybe never like, you've only shopped for a hoe maybe at a garden store, or if you're like, oh, it can only be tractors, I think there's been a lot of really interesting, I don't know if it's quite innovation because some of it is like old stuff that became new again, but there's been a lot of movement and activity in developing like hand scale, not full size four-wheel tractor tools that are more appropriate for like the smaller scale market type gardener. There's all kinds of really interesting, I don't know if they're new or just rediscovered, shipped to America, all different kinds of hose. There are hose that mimic and do similar functions to like some of the tools that you see mounted to a tractor. So there's like pine weeding hose and like hose. There's all kinds of interesting hose shapes and orientations that are designed to run really shallowly in the soil and like kill white thread stage weeds. Um, those are really interesting to look at, especially if you're like, I don't have a hoe I love. If you do a lot of hand weeding, like it is worth the time to find a hoe you love. There's been a lot of interesting innovations, newer releases in wheel hose. So something that is human powered, has one or two wheels, and you can attach different types of implements to it that move the soil and target weeds at different life stages. There's some models coming in from Europe that are really interesting and allow you to try things like finger weeders, which are a newer weeding tool coming out of Europe where you have like a rubber finger that allows you to uh, do pretty aggressive cultivation within the row with your crop. And you have all kinds of interesting walk behind tractor stuff happening right now. Like Tillmore like makes walk behind tractors that are specific to cultivation that you can do all kinds of interesting weed management stuff with and assembling and making different combinations of tools all on one rig that is not like I get scared when I use like a rototiller. Like those are quite forceful and really shake you around. But like the tractors that are designed to do the light weeding cultivation are quite manageable, even if you are not like a tall, muscular person. What? Okay, we have a question about flame weeding in the chat. So flame weeding can be really good, but it also can like do nothing. And so much of it comes down to the specific weed species you have and where the growing point of that species of weed is. So for example, with the grasses, sometimes the growing point is like beneath the soil. So it's really hard for a flame weeder to hit it. Um, and I know that Sarah Resource has some really good information about getting a flame weeder to work and figuring out if the weeds you have a flame weeder is a good match for or not. Someone says they have good success with an eco weeder. Oh yeah, these are cool. Yes, once you get to like the world of tractor scale cultivation, there's been a lot of tool development in the last 10 to 20 years, a lot of it coming out of Europe. Um, that sometimes you have someone driving a tractor or not driving the tractor, and there's someone like operating a tool, and then you have like the whole new world of like more computer powered weed management tools that I've not seen at a scale that is appropriate for Minnesota vegetable farms, but I do love to think about like what if there was a laser Roomba that was like out there shooting a tiny laser at weeds. That's a future I would like to live in, I think. All right. I know I punted some of your questions, so I'm going to put my email in the chat so you have it right there if you want to specifically ask me about burning weed or if you want to talk more specifically about anything. I know the ultimate extension answer is it depends, but each weed has its own personality, so it truly does depend. But I'm happy to have more in-depth conversations about anything we talked about here. Um, Otherwise, maybe we will wrap early. We are back next week. I forgot to look up the topic. You're free of me. I've been on for 3 weeks, so I know it's not me. Um, Ooh, I think our next one might be about pollinators. That'll be good. So if you want to talk about bug stuff from someone who's not me, tune in next week, and I'll also be back next month to talk a little bit about plant diseases. So if you're like, she keeps talking about plant diseases, but we haven't talked about it yet, that's because it's coming up in March. Otherwise, I will let you all go. Have at least in the winter, there's no weeds, so enjoy a cold but weed-free day, everybody.